We'd like to thank you for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm in Atlanta. We have the great privilege today of having with us Jim Satterfield, Suzy Loughlin, and we hope we're going to get Harry Rhulen. Harry had an emergency he was attending to. He should join us during the broadcast. We're going to be talking about what happened in 2014 and how what lessons we have learned from 2014 that we can apply in 2015. We'd like to invite you to become our friend, Firestorm Solutions. Well, I'm getting a real strange, could you try to show that slide again, Jim? It's all garbled.
Bill,
there we are. Perfect. Firestorm.
Breaking up.
Okay. We're on Become our Facebook friend at Firestorm Solutions. You can also follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag that you can use. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risks and crises. Firestorm's expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind, the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product we provide must be read and considered in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. This information should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion, or in some cases perhaps medical advice or medical opinion. Today we're talking about Crisis Lessons Learned. This is the year in review. It's a roundtable discussion. You can go to firestorm.com and where you can register for future webinars, or you can watch all kinds of past webinars on a variety of subjects. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series. Our presenters today, Jim Satterfield, the President and Chief Operating Officer, Suzy Loughlin, our Executive Vice President and Chief Administrative Officer. We hope that we're going to have Harry Rhulen on with us shortly. He is the Chief Executive Officer.
Harry, by the way, for everyone on the call today, one of our clients is facing a crisis and got a call just prior to the webinar, so clients and crisis kind of trump everything else. We hope that we had contained all crises in 2014 and no one would experience anything this year. And unfortunately, that has continued to evolve.
I do see that Harry is coming in, though, so Harry should be with us momentarily.
He'll be joining us.
Harry has been here since the beginning, but it's interesting to listen to people talk about him in absentia. So thank you all, and I'm pleased to join you today.
That's good. We're glad to have you, Harry, and it's always a pleasure to talk about you in absentia, but that's a joke at another time for another call as we go forward. We have a lot of things to talk about today, and hopefully what you just heard is an example of this is designed to be a roundtable. So we're going to bring you some perspectives on the issues and what's carrying forward. The quote that you see on the screen literally came from Harry Kissinger. There can't be a crisis next week. My calendar is already full. Most of us don't have the luxury of determining when events will take place around them, around us, and to what we look forward to. We will talk a lot about what the impacts are on our businesses and in our schools, and we have a very large mixed audience today, both representing business and government and education on the call. So we're going to try to bring some insights that we think will be appropriate to you across all those areas. When you think about predicting your next crisis, can you identify your organization's next crisis? I'd like you to stop and think about, and I know some of you are in conference rooms with others from your company listening to today's webinar, to think about what is it that you're worried about? What will your organization's next crisis be? You see on the screen behind the word crisis a bunch of different types of threats that could be listed, and many of these go beyond the natural disasters or violence issues that you might think about that can have a significant impact upon your business. And so looking at that, can you identify your organization's next crisis? We can. And I think that's a theme that you're going to hear described a little bit as we get into it today. So that's our lead-in to set up to begin to talk about what's going on. When we think about 2014 and all of the things that have impacted us here around the world, and we've talked about a lot of the aspects of this area, what I would like to do is to ask Harry and Suzy to think about this and say, what one word comes to mind regarding 2014 crises? For those of you who are listening to the webinar, I'd like you to think about last year. Think about all the things that occurred and think about what's the one word that would come to your mind as we do that. Suzy, we're going to start with you. Is there a word that comes to mind when you think about last year in crises?
I think, Jim, the word that resonates with me the most, it perhaps doesn't go hand in hand with the word crisis, but I think everyone will know what I mean by it, and that's the word social. I believe that every crisis now is impacted as a result of the way we communicate through social media, and to me, that's the biggest game changer that affects everything, all of the outcomes and all of the plans and all the things we need to do to prepare.
Good. I can see where that would come together. Harry, do you want to add some thoughts?
Well, it's interesting that Suzy chose social, because when I saw the question come up on the screen, the first thing that occurred to me was technology. More and more, the way in which crises happen and the way that they get created involves some type of technology. So even the terrorists who are perpetrating a lot of the crimes that we see on TV now are more and more either using technology or they're actually perpetrating their crimes through technology. Now, that's a double-edged sword. Obviously, the use of technology also gives you a tool to be able to prevent problems. So, you know, there's always a trail that's left. So in the same way that we're trying to track down the Sony hackers, or we're trying to, you know, see what the Russian hackers are doing, there's an opportunity for prevention that's created with technology as well. So I think more and more as we go forward, technology is both a tool for good and a tool for bad. So that's something worth talking about.
I think if I was thinking about one word that would come to mind, it would be the word surprise. If the fact that a crisis occurs, it comes as a surprise to the organization. Because if they had known it was going to happen, they could have had a plan, trained their people, been ready to carry forward. And so when we think about this, a crisis isn't business as usual. It's business as unusual as we come together. So that's
Jim,
kind of got.
Jim, can I just jump in? And I just want to take one issue with that word surprise, because I think what you'll find in most situations with a look back, rarely did these things come by surprise. There were, and I know we'll talk about this further, but there were warning signs and indicators, and I think, you know, if we want to take the, you know, head in the sand view that these things all come as a surprise, that's fine, but, you know, from a preparedness standpoint, you know, that won't win the day.
And for a contrarian view, that's a great answer, and we actually agree as we talk about it. As we think about this, let's talk about trends. You'll see on the screen in front of you, and again, think about as you're sitting in your office listening to the webinar today, are crises increasing and decreasing? And what do you have to say about that? And you'll see some definition of a crisis over to the left, and just a sample listing of what some might consider a crisis that would occur within a business or organization. So, Harry, when you talk about trends for 2014, what kind of a trend comes to mind to you at this point?
Well, you know, it's really interesting. We talk about crises, whether they're increasing or decreasing. I think most people in the world would have the perception that crisis is increasing. You know, and that tends to affect our perception of trends. So certainly trends in terms of cyber terrorism, in terms of hacking, things like that, those technology-related crimes seem to be on the increase. But one of the things that I would really point out is these things have been going on forever. As long as there's been any kind of technology, you know, whether it's current computer technology or whatever the technology was at the time, there were always people who were using those things to their advantage. I think the big difference today is because we all carry a smartphone in our pocket, we're aware of everything that goes on. As a matter of fact, we're aware of a lot of them while they're going on. People are actually tuning in and watching as the crisis develops. And that's a very different world than we lived in even 3 or 4 years ago.
Suzy, observation?
Yeah, I agree. I think that, the awareness factor is what's changed. And again, back to, the technology or social media or the many ways we now have instant information reaching us, whatever the tool is that we're using. So I think, but I also do think, when we talk about technology, and of course cyber is on everyone's radar, but I do think we are seeing, a real exponential increase in the numbers of these events. So I kind of have to put that one on the list that seems to be surely increasing.
Suzy, you made an example. We were talking earlier this morning to everybody that's here, and just talking about the webinar today and what we were going to say. Suzy, I thought you brought up an interesting tie back to your social aspect and trends here about the airplane crash in San Francisco. Can you make that point again, please?
Well, I made the point that, and many of you on the phone, if you've participated in any of the training Firestorm does, we often talk about the fact that, you don't really control your message, and that because of social media, the capability of delivering information is so fast. So one of the examples I often use is the Oceana airliner that crashed, on its approach to the San Francisco airport. And what happened was that the passengers that there were 2 deaths, I believe it was 2, but the surviving passengers got outside the plane and, used their phones to tweet images of the crash, and I believe it was the first notice that the plane had crashed. So, speed it's just rapid, and therefore, as a result, from a trending perspective, we can only expect this will continue, and therefore messaging and everything that we'll need to deal with these matters has to be planned well in advance.
And I think that's certainly true. And to go back to the point, Harry, that you raised earlier, I think our awareness levels are higher today. Social media is busy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that information is out there. And Suzy, that's where you corrected me on the other slide, just reinforcing that knowledge there, that information is there. Converting that information into intelligence is an area that we'd look at. We've certainly seen some increase in data breaches, and we're going to talk about that, I think, a little bit later as we discuss things today. But again, directing everyone to that box where the crisis is described, it's a risk event for which one has not identified the vulnerabilities and exposures, has not developed a plan, and therefore does not know how to respond. That's what we're trying to make sure that everybody today is thinking about their organization and what does that mean to you within your company. So what events come to mind? We've got a lot of things that went on this year. We could spend a lot of time talking about a bunch of things. Harry, you've already mentioned the Ebola a little bit. Harry, Suzy, do you want to make any observations about any particular event that comes to mind?
Well, yeah, let me jump in on the Ebola issue. I found the Ebola issue to be fascinating because I think what it proved was that the media can create a situation where there really isn't one. So here in the United States, the chance that any individual is going to be exposed to the Ebola virus is infinitesimal. Yet it was on everybody's mind. I mean, I walked into stores where people who were working as clerks were talking about the Ebola virus. And I think, again, you talk about a double-edged sword. It's a wonderful opportunity. It's the kind of thing where communicable illness is probably the most significant killer, not only worldwide, but within this country as well. Once you get beyond some of the traditional health problems like heart attack, cancer, things of that nature. But I think what the Ebola scare showed me was that the ability to manipulate people's perceptions through media is extremely high. But again, I think it also showed me that with the right kind of presentation, you can get people to tune into the communicable illness issue. Billions of dollars are lost annually in the United States by businesses to the standard A and B flu. Every organization, whether it's a school school, a corporation, whatever you do, there needs to be a communicable illness plan as part of your overall emergency response planning process. And it just was a very, very interesting thing for me to see how that Ebola thing developed.
Suzy, as we think about events, anything come to mind?
You know, Jim, there were so many, and I think one of the challenges I'm having when we think about the discussion is, you know, focusing on 2014, which is, I mean, obviously critical to the title of your webinar, but I feel somewhat that the events of last week, you know, really overshadow, you know, or at least are front and center for us to bring up. And I think that the increasing terrorism threat, you know, that we see, and not just the events in Paris, but we saw others. And I think that the enhanced levels that we're seeing of security, whether it's, you know, increasing the way we do searches in airports, or our daily way of life is gradually changing, and I think that will be a trend that is going to continue.
As we think about a lot of these things, data breaches, certainly many come to mind, and I listed only Sony here. We could have listed Home Depot, ad infinitum, or the one today in du jour that's coming out. Ferguson, how many of us on the call today had heard of Ferguson prior to the events of the summer?
Jim, stop for 1 second, because you mentioned Sony or Home Depot, you know, Target, whatever, the one du jour. I think everybody on this phone call needs to think about also, those are the big ones, but if your organization processes a credit card, so if you take credit cards for payment, if you have a system that in any way is open to the Internet, those same hackers are looking at you. So that needs to be part of your emergency planning, your preparedness planning as well. And don't just assume they're looking for the big guys. So I'm sorry to interrupt. I think the Ferguson thing is important, but I just wanted to get that in there.
Well, a couple of comments here. The FBI stated that everybody will be breached. It's not a matter of an if, it's a when. And there are those companies that know they've been breached and those companies that haven't been breached. I'm sitting in Atlanta in the conference room here with a group of people as we're talking about it, and Jack Healy, off our expert council and the managing director of our business crisis risk program, was sitting next to me, and he reminded me that the data breaches at the big firms were caused by data breaches in smaller firms. Their suppliers were the avenues that came in. So this is a situation that this is a growing complex area to think about. We've all seen the product recalls at General Motors. And then going back to the Ferguson area, I'd never heard of Ferguson, Missouri. Well, we were having our pre-conversation today about the webinar. One of the people made the comment that, well, don't forget that Rodney King in L.A. and the riots that were there, for those of you on the call that are older, you know, those will be the defining moments that come back and come together to share for this. I want to ask Jack to tell us just a little bit of an interesting story about Ebola, to frame it from a small business perspective that I think you're going to find interesting. Jack, you were sharing a story. That you want to share that with us?
Yeah, so everybody knows the pandemic and the Ebola, but there was a business crisis risk side to it as well. The Dallas nurse that was infected went home to Akron, Ohio for her wedding, and she was looking for a wedding dress, and she shopped at one particular shop in Akron. After this came out, the owners of the shop closed the shop down for 2 or 3 days and had a crew come in and clean everything. And so that was in November. They closed the shop last week. Their business fell off so dramatically after it was known that this nurse shopped there. They never were able to recover, even though they advertised and they had big signs saying, you know, it's safe to come in here. It killed their business. So it was a risk. It was a fallout from this, and it was a risk that they didn't, you know, they handled it tactically, but they didn't handle it strategically.
Thanks, Jack. And I think it's
Great point.
Trying to bring this in and making it personal is one of the elements that we're trying to do in the webinar. Harry, I cut you off, and you were going to make an observation, so go ahead.
Well, my observation there, which is very interesting, I wasn't aware of what Jack just mentioned, but one of the things we talk about, and many of the people on this call have heard us talk about, is the attrition rate after any type of a natural disaster. So, a certain percentage of businesses get shut down and never reopen after a hurricane, a tornado, whatever it might be. But the attrition after that, where you lose over the course of the coming year and then 2 years, there's a large percentage of businesses that then fail because of their failure to plan and their failure to have appropriately managed the vulnerabilities and exposures that they have. So this is exactly what Jack was just saying, and there's a tremendous volume of data to support that process.
So as we move forward, I think, Harry, you did a good segue for us to start to think about what are some of the lessons that are learned. Everyone sees on the screen a bunch of topics and some lessons or related areas around that. We should probably comment on some of these or even other lessons that were learned from the events last year. Harry, Suzy, one of you care to start?
Well, you know what, Jim, I just actually want to jump in on a comment. It would be a lesson learned that I think relates to the story Jack just shared, and it's something that Karen Masulo, who I believe is also on the call, Karen's our EVP and Director of Business Intelligence and Social Media. Karen always points out to our clients, the importance of developing and building brand attractors, people who value your brand, who are vocal about your brand, your satisfied customers, your satisfied employees, because when something bad does happen, you really need those people to rally around you to quickly shut down the any negative type of, or what she would call a brand detractor, a comment from such a person. So I don't know the details around this bridal shop story, but obviously with social media, the way people communicate now, it's understandable as to how this outcome could have occurred, particularly if a business isn't prepared and hasn't really used social media in a way to build their brand and to build brand loyalty. So I think if you're out there using social media to advertise and promote your business, it's really important that you think through the way those people come to rescue you when the time comes. So that's just one lesson I think we've seen in many examples.
Suzy, go ahead, Karen. What are you going to say?
This is Karen. I wanted to add to that story Jack had shared on that wedding bridal shop is the brand advocates did come to attempt to come to this store's rescue and actually started a fundraising page to help save the shop. But it was a little bit too late, and the owner of the store wasn't even aware that that was going on, and it was really reticent to accept sort of that outpouring. Whether it's enough to help them recover or not, it will be said in the future. But there was an interesting response in social media by the brand advocates.
On this chart that you see on the screen, you see the words crisis management - consequence management. It's not about crisis management. It's about the consequence management from the related area. Harry, I think that would be good to have you speak to that or any of the other topics.
We're opening a lot of doors. As far as speaking on the issue of crisis and consequence management, one of the things that I run into on a regular basis is we get called in to assist an organization who's had some type of an occurrence, a crisis. And by the time we get there, the crisis is over. Most of the organizations we work with have some type of preparedness in place where they've managed the crisis to the best of their ability. So what we really are being brought in for is to assist in consequence management. What is it going to look like a day from now, a week from now, a month from now, a year from now? And that's what most organizations have not thought of. There are so many consequences to the decisions that you make today. So where it might seem like a good idea to send out a press release today, the impact of it, the negative search engine optimization, the social media aspects, all of those things that come back to haunt you down the road aren't being thought of. So that consequence management aspect is probably the most important thing that we bring to the table. And I've had an interesting thing happen twice in the last couple of weeks. I've had clients come to me and say things like, "You're prophetic," or "How did you know?" or "You're a genius." And my answer to them is no. None of that is the case. I've been to the movie. We've seen this before, and crises and the consequence of crises tend to unfold in a very consistent pattern. And, I referred to technology earlier. I think technology is making it such that the pattern that they follow is very predictable and in some cases controllable. So having someone there who can help guide you through is very important. But I think what that also points out is because it is predictable, you can therefore plan for it. So you can build into your crisis communications plan something that gives very specific instruction to your people. I know that, further on, Jim, we've got some slides where we can talk more about this, but your crisis communications plan has to anticipate not just what you're going to do, not just what your family members are going to do, but all kinds of people who may go out on social media and say things that come back to haunt you. So we can talk more about that as we get further on into your presentation.
And just one last thing to add to that, Jim. I think also the other thing that's really different, we're seeing, due to the fact that most people have a cell phone or a device that can record. If you remember the shooting at FedEx, we heard the 911 call, we heard the confusion, but you also heard, what we'll call citizen journalists' accounts of what they captured. So I think it's really important to understand that, again, the story gets told by others, and our role, obviously, when we're dealing with the aftermath of an event, is to be extremely transparent, and this goes to that explaining is losing. There is no explaining that can ever change the outcome of what occurred. And unfortunately, when you hear people trying to do it, you immediately, you tune out, or you, even worse, think that they're not being truthful. So I think factoring in, as Harry said, all the technology and knowing that there will likely be an account, an accurate account, or at least a version of it that others will be aware of, that has to be taken into all of your planning and your messaging.
A lot of information on the slide. We could spend an entire day and just do this one slide and talk about these topics. The intelligence network monitoring lets you know what others are saying and what's already out there, and your goal here is to know first and not be surprised with it. The data breach is, what are you going to say? You're going to have a data breach. We've been working with companies and boards and helping them prepare to be able to say those things. But I want to move beyond these lessons learned and talk a little bit about who are some of the losers from 2014. And you see a sample here, and we could have actually taken about 20 pages of slides to list down who the losers were and talk about these from a variety of perspectives. And we're trying, in all of our calls today, in all of our conversations, we're not trying to be political in any way. I still intend to vote for Putin for re-election whenever I can. Unfortunately, I won't be given that opportunity, but that'll be fine associated with it. Does anybody have an observation about any of these or any other losers from 2014? Harry, coal may not come as a clear, obvious one. Can you explain that punching bag line?
Sure. Firestorm does a lot of work in the coal industry, working with mining companies and a lot of the support companies. And coal has allowed itself, the coal industry allowed itself to be used as a punching bag, in my opinion, in 2014, from the standpoint that it's being used as the scapegoat for global climate change. As everyone on the call knows, the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are at the highest level, certainly in recorded history, and going back and doing research using the Arctic ice shelves and things, they're able to show that it's at the highest level that it's been in millennia. So coal, which is a very small or a fractional participant in the overall CO2, there are much more automobiles, farming, there's lots of other causes, but coal allowed itself, without responding, to be portrayed as the villain. And I think that, again, going back to what I mentioned earlier about Ebola, the media was able to use that for their own purpose, and the stories were heard, they were very meaningful. 60 Minutes recently did a rehash of a coal ash story that was one from years ago that they reinvented because coal is now an easy target. And again, I think that what this comes from is a lack of proper recognition of the risk, of the vulnerability, a lack of any kind of a plan, and no general. No one who is in charge of speaking on behalf of the industry. And this is the same thing that we talk to those of you who've been involved with Firestorm in crisis situations. We always say there has to be a leader. Someone must be the general. Someone must take charge and be accountable. And you just don't see that in this situation.
Obviously, there are a lot of things that are listed here. The police are being defined by events like Ferguson. Almost every time an event has occurred, it's being reinterpreted. This isn't a new story. It's a story that's happened in previous years. We cited the Rodney King example. Freedom Industries was the spill in the Elk River in West Virginia. And if you remember the way that some of the responses that were done from the leadership as they were standing there drinking their bottled water and they were tired and they just wanted to go home. And you had businesses and schools and families that were disrupted and impacted. Putin certainly conducted the invasion and I think underestimated the impact of the sanctions on his country and what that meant and that level of response. The reason Obama is listed here was the illegal incursion or an invasion when the Russians went in, his initial phrase on that, and you saw for several days the news cycle being dominated by trying to understand what's the difference between an illegal incursion and an invasion. It was a misspeak associated with that, and as the staff tried to come and make sense out of that in the area. The Sony, in terms of the data breach and what the impact was on the employees and the stakeholders there, identifying the various stakeholders and communicating effectively. We could go on, but there were losers.
Jim, can I just add one point? I think, though, there's a theme that's in a lot of them, and you know, it has to do with the way we're communicating and the word choices we make and the downplaying or the soft selling of facts that occurred. You know, so whether you want to call something hacking or cyber vandalism, you know, as an example, you know, in an effort to downplay the magnitude of a data breach. I mean, so I think, you know, what you see is, you know, when we get to the winners, I think some of the winners really, the theme is transparency and straightforwardness. And now, of course, that some of you are looking at this now, and I'm sure you can be laughing right now when you think about some of it. So we'll tell you why some of these are on here. But I mean, why don't I just lead in, like with the GM CEO? You know, she was named Crisis Manager of the Year by Fortune magazine, and actually I'm glad Jack Healy's in the room because Jack wrote a very interesting blog article that was posted about a week ago on Firestorm's blog, and it was a really good analysis of what makes a good crisis manager. And you know, I can't really comment specifically on whether the GM CEO was a good crisis manager or whether, you know, just her genuineness, whether she's compassionate, whether her transparency, you know, will turn out to all bear out. You know, I think time will tell. But Jack, I'm going to quote you on something here because I think it was really well said. Jack's definition of who the crisis manager of the year is somebody that you will never know. It's the person you never heard about, because the person you've never heard about, you know, it's a person who reacts quickly and decisively, puts people first, and keeps the crisis from cascading, keeping records of decisions made and declaring a crisis over, and most importantly, this is my qualification, creating a learning tool for their organization. So whether or not the GM CEO will turn out to have done all these things, we'll see. But I think Jack's point is a good one, that most organizations who manage crises successfully you never hear about.
And so that's why there's a blank line below attorneys, I think, on the page. It's all those people you've never heard about in going there. We listed the Republicans because obviously the change of control, the elections, the forecasts that were out here, and that will have a direct impact on us in 2015, and seeing what, and it'll be interesting what happens as a result of that. Is this used for good, or is it not? In transforming crisis into value is a constant theme that we look for within Firestorm and coming together. Now, attorneys seem to be a surprising one to have on the list here for winners in 2014, but every time there's a crisis, there's going to be a lawsuit. There'll be multiple lawsuits from multiple people on multiple sides, and so they're clearly a winner. As Jack shared effectively the story about the bridal shop, there was a story this year that came out where an employee was commenting on social media about sexual harassment that she was experiencing at work from her supervisor. And ultimately, the HR department at the company was able, because they were doing some effective monitoring, seeing that and contacted the employee to see what they could do to intervene and help and take care of the situation. By the time the HR department had contacted her, she'd been contacted by 4 plaintiffs' attorneys to sue the company as a result of this sexual harassment that was there. So sexual harassment, social media, crises, all are fertile ground for attorneys as we go forward and winners as we look at it. Let's talk about some advice now. We've been talking about what we've seen and trends and shifts here. There's a lot of advice listed on this, and we can talk about a great many of these as we go forward, but the fact that every crisis is a human crisis, and it's the people, it's about your people, your organization. Those aspects make a difference. Harry, as we were talking earlier, you really, I thought, did an excellent job of coming back to predict, plan, perform. Can you share that observation again?
Well, you know, as everyone on the call knows, predict, plan, perform is the process that Firestorm uses for most of the work that we do. And I think that one of the things that I'm really concerned about is that the organizations that I worked with in 2014 all want to jump to perform. One of the issues with being a very competent business person, whether you're running a school or a corporation or whatever else it might be, is that you know in your own head what all the, or what you believe all the vulnerabilities and threats are. You know how you're going to handle them, and therefore you're ready, you're prepared to jump directly to perform. One of the things that we see is a big reason for crisis is that the predictive work has not been done, and therefore the plans haven't been developed, and that the individual who may have had the information to be able to perform either wasn't there at the time or for one reason may have been involved in the crisis. The other thing is, other than those of you on the call today who are preparedness professionals, people who are being paid to do just that function, the rest of you have a day job. And as a result of that, you have work to do that prevents you from taking the time to do the predictive work, from doing the planning work, and therefore it gets short shrift. And therefore when it does come time to perform, you really can't. So, you know, bringing in a Firestorm or having a process where you have a third party that assists in that overall process makes a huge difference, because it makes sure that you're continually moving forward. You know, one of the things you hear us talk about all the time is continuous improvement. You know, you don't have to have the perfect plan today, but you want to always be moving it forward. And that doesn't happen to a great extent because we don't follow that predict, plan, perform process.
Thanks, Harry. I thought that was a good tie-in and related back. Before we leave this slide and move to winding down our meeting today, we've had a lot of questions that have come in. We're not going to be able to get to everyone live on air, but we are going to reach out to everyone on the call today, answer your questions, and we can share some things. To know why you're speaking under the message maps, what are the 3 key messages to each stakeholder group for each one of the threats, risks, vulnerabilities that are out there become critical? We've all been around children, and you would make a statement and they would go, why? and you provide a clarification, and they would go, why? And then you provide more information, and they go, why again? One of the mistakes we find is that people talk when they don't need to, and they talk about the wrong things. So if you're helping as a preparedness professional on the call today or in an organization and someone wants to communicate, ask them why. And then ask that again and again and again. And the majority of the time, immediately in the crisis, because most everything you learn in the first 24 hours is wrong, you're going to be giving the wrong message as we come together. So this leads us to who's responsible. And the answer to that is leadership. The leadership is responsible to preparing for risk as we think about these things. It could be head of school if you're an independent school, or superintendent, or a principal if you're a public school. It could be the president, the CEO. It could be anyone within the organization is responsible for that. But the key failure that we find is that most management teams aren't ready to identify impending risks before they occur. They're having to react afterwards. And so knowing about them in advance makes a large difference. And if we don't eliminate these risks, it's going to have an adverse impact, disproportionately large, upon our people, brand, or reputation. So can you really predict a crisis? The answer is overwhelmingly yes. You've got to know what the warning signs are, and looking at that. And you've heard us talk a lot about behaviors of concern on that side of the house. And it comes down into looking at what the indicators are and making sure that our research has shown that indicators can shape the frequency and severity. And so there are these identifiable patterns that you want to look for. And so the value is understanding those in advance. The indicators are clue cues, and that's always a tongue twister for me to say as that process comes along, and in the afternoon without an extra cup of coffee, it's doubly hard to talk about. But it's about emerging events, and the difference between information and intelligence starts to come together. And it could be behavioral, transactional, process changes that come together, and they're transmitted by verbal and nonverbal means. So our goal today is, how do you know what you don't know? How do you know what you don't know? And the only solution to that is creating an intelligence network. And you'll see behind an intelligence network what looks a little bit technology-oriented behind it. Some of this is technology, some of this is people, some of it's intuition, some of it's awareness, some of it is understanding what the triggers are and having the right action at the right time. So our goals today are to know what's going to happen tomorrow within your business. It's predict, plan, perform. Harry, I thought, said it very well. We find many people jump immediately to perform and don't do the predictive work and don't develop the plans there, and they don't communicate them. Firestorm has done assessments of hundreds and hundreds of companies and schools around the country, and invariably will find that they haven't tested their plans. They haven't trained their people. They don't have plans in a lot of the areas. They haven't fully identified the risk, and they don't understand the impacts. Those things will make a difference. Our goal is to transform uncertainty into certainty. And what are the metrics within your organization as we focus on it? So to process, you must listen and look. And we're going to talk more about listening and look in coming webinars this year, and particularly this quarter, as we're focused on a webinar stream around creating an intelligence network. It's the what, the when, the where, the pattern around those areas. And when we use listening, we're referring to aggregating and identifying what's being communicated regarding your organization and your people. We'll utilize streams and phrases and words, and it creates a general situational awareness. Looking is then when we know something specifically that we're concerned about, a specific location, an event, or a person, based upon an identified crisis, threat, risk, or an exposure or vulnerability. We can go through a geocoding and look at that location around your particular area. We looked at a facility for one of our clients that we're talking with, and we identified a person there who had made 50 postings and tweets within a 1-8-hour shift. Found out there was tension between that person and their boss, and that he had reached a decision that the only way to resolve it was to bring a gun to work tomorrow. So if you were that organization, wouldn't you want to know about that today, that the problem had escalated to that level, that was the only area? We also have the ability here to look at spheres of influence. Who is this person talking to? And the ability to go back into time and to see what were they saying last week or last month. And so this time value of this, it really truly can become a time machine associated. So looking is targeted awareness. Predictive intelligence is one of the most imperishable forms of that is communications. What's being said, it varies over time. There's hard and soft data, and we'll go into this in more detail, and you'll see here what soft data is, and hard data could be emails and postings and social media. Technology can help us analyze and put those analytics, but you need a central repository to pull it all together in one place at one time. So for next steps, do you want to know what will happen tomorrow? If you answered yes, then you need to be thinking about an intelligence network. If you answered no, can you afford not to know? If you would like to know more about it, you can contact us at Firestorm to talk about how you align your plans to best practices, to create your own intelligence network, or even to schedule some crisis coach training to deal with some of the issues that we talked about today. If you'd like to know where your plans are relative to standards and best practices, if you're a business, we can do a business continuity assessment. If you're a school, we can do a preparedness assessment, or we can do a social media or workplace violence assessment. And we'll waive the cost of that if you'll just reach out to us. It's where you start. You've got to know where you are to know where you want to end up and to carry forward. I'd like to thank Harry and Suzy and Karen and Jack for appearing today and talking with us on this subject. And you can get more information at firestorm.com. You can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can call us at the 800 number that you see listed there. So thank you for spending time with us today. There'll be more about the future webinar series as we move forward. I thank everybody for sharing this time. Harry, Suzy, one last word from either of you before we close today?
Vigilance.
Vigilance, good. Suzy, any last word?
Yeah, I'm still on the planning. I'm going to just put one sentence around it. One of our generals, General Wilmot, talked about the fact that, let's quote Eisenhower when he said, plans are nothing, planning is everything. And it's the process of planning that will prepare you, even if you have to divert from those plans when the time comes. But the planning process gives you the discipline that will enable you to perform at a higher level if you do find yourself in crisis.
And with that, we'll give you the last word. Thanks, everyone. We look forward to having you join us next month for another webinar, and as we continue sharing some information with you. May 2015 be your best year ever. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Bye-bye.